Good morning. So last Sunday, Brian started us in a little bit of a conversation about what it means to come to table, what it means to say that we welcome all specifically to this table behind me. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more this morning, and I want to dig into that by talking about the movie Wonder, or the book. Book or movie? Anybody seen it? Yeah? If you have a child in elementary or middle school at JCPS, chances are they've had to read it as part of their curriculum. So on the screen, the one with just the face is the book cover, and then the other one's the movie poster. So Wonder is the story about a kid named Augie Pullman, and Augie has what's called Treacher-Collins syndrome. Treacher-Collins syndrome is genetic, and it is marked by a severely disfigured face in children when they are born. Augie has a very difficult time as a result of his Treacher-Collins. And you can imagine how difficult it would be for a young person, for any of us, let's be honest, to have disfigurations of that magnitude. You'll see in the movie poster that he's got a kind of a space mask on. That's how he protects himself. That's how Augie helps himself feel safe. Kids wonder if what Augie has is catching. Kids wonder if he is some sort of alien. Some laugh and point and tease mercilessly. And the one place that this all plays out big time is in the lunchroom. Y'all remember that, right? The school lunchroom? Wondering who you might sit with? I went to 3 elementary schools and 2 middle schools across 4 cities and 2 states. It's okay, Mom. And I can assure you that I know what it's like to walk into a new lunchroom terrified. And maybe you do too. In fact, I would bet that there are some of you in this room, or you know someone in this room, who's wondering who they're going to sit with when school starts on Wednesday. Especially if you're going to a new school, or if they're going to a new campus of their school. And if you've ever felt alone in a place where a lot of people are eating and having fun together, I hope that you are able to find a friend like Augie does in this scene that I'm about to show you. Augie's headed into the lunchroom, and he's being made fun of and pointed at until one very brave classmate decides that enough is enough. Okay, so Summer, who sat with Augie, she's pretty much my hero. And I would love to say that that's because I would have done the same thing at her age, but I got to tell you, I'm not sure I would have. I was way too wrapped up in what people thought about me, and in walking a very fine line between in crowd and out crowd. I was much too concerned about the things that I have blessedly and finally learned in my 40s don't matter. And truthfully, I think the vast majority of our kids are more like Summer than they are the mean girls. And when our kids fail to be Summers, it's generally because an adult has taught them that negative behavior. It's our fault in how we behave and how we label other people and how we teach our children in ways vocal and not that money talks and fame matters and appearance rules, and these things are lies and we know it. And we break our children's hearts when we allow them to believe that they're true. To be honest, I'm thinking about school lunchrooms this morning because my daughter and some other kids that I care a whole lot about are starting school this week, specifically middle school. And a new year of school always brings with it anxiety, and appropriately so, but that's especially true when it's a new school or a new situation. Thankfully, Maddie is much smarter and much more grounded than her mother was at 11. And I am confident that she'll be fine, but I also know it won't be easy because middle school, right? Many of you know that I did youth ministry full-time for about 15 years, and oh my goodness, middle school. It's like a field of landmines that you're just trying to avoid half the time. But the other half of the time, middle schoolers are so amazing. They have the best and bravest hearts. And I am actually pretty convinced that we are all just middle schoolers at heart, no matter what age we are, trying to figure out who we are and what we're about and who we're going to eat with. But it's not just the school lunchroom or wonder that has me thinking about who we're going to eat with this morning. It's Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus. If you're singing the song Zacchaeus was a wee little man in your head right now, that's okay. I did it all week. But Zacchaeus is one of the more colorful characters in the gospel, and often one of the first stories that our children learn in Sunday school or vacation Bible school. And I'm a little bit jealous if you're about to hear this story for the first time. Angie and I were talking about between services that we've both known this story for over 40 years, and it's hard to hear something new. But this week I think I did. Zacchaeus, the short little tax collector that nobody liked and whose reputation said that he regularly screwed people over in collections. The one Jesus chose to go home with for dinner despite those who grumbled and got angry and whined about it. Here's Zacchaeus' story. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and he was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him, and all who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be with the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." And then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." When I think of table, of what it means specifically to gather at this communion table where we tell you every week that all are welcome, Jesus eating with Zacchaeus is often my very first thought. Jesus hung out and ate with lots of questionable folks. The disciples themselves were a pretty motley crew. And then there was Mary Magdalene and Mary and Martha, women who were his best friends, which was just not done at the time. And then Zacchaeus. It's safe to say that Jesus just didn't toe the line. And that's what riled up the Pharisees so much. Brian talked about that last week. The Pharisees, that religious and political sect that cared way more about power than they did about loving anyone, Jesus drove them bonkers. Because he didn't follow the rules of what they deemed an acceptable society. He didn't adhere to their dictates about what it meant to be a person of faith. He didn't color inside the lines, and he didn't speak as they commanded. And this was super threatening for them. And then here he is in this story about Zacchaeus inviting himself to go have lunch with a sinner. Jesus hardly ever followed the rules, y'all. but he always loved. And he loved hard. Bottom line, no matter what. That doesn't mean he didn't get angry. And it doesn't mean that he didn't grieve. And it doesn't mean that he didn't sometimes wonder what the point was. But he kept loving all people, always. And for me, what I believe is that this is, more than anything, what it means to follow Jesus. And it is not easy. Some of you may know who Brother Will Campbell is, and if you don't, I'm really excited that I get to introduce you to him this morning. Will Campbell was a preacher, an author, a civil rights activist. He was also professed friend and pastor to all sorts of questionable folks, to the broken of any place or time, to anyone on the fringe, to those in prison, to white supremacists, to Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson, two of my favorite questionable characters. Anyone that he saw in need of God's love. Campbell was born in the mid-1920s in Amite County, Mississippi, and at the age of 17, the church that raised him, East Fork Baptist Church, ordained him to preach. At 17. And so he did. Everywhere and often, eventually becoming one of the most well-known, if perhaps a wee bit controversial, preachers in the United States. He later went on to get a degree from Yale, but it's not the degree from Yale that hung over the mantle of his little house in Tennessee that he lived in until his death. It was a letter of ordination from the elders of East Fork Baptist Church. Because in them is where Campbell rooted his calling to preach God's love, first and foremost and always. He was as likely to be found at the local watering hole with all sorts of local folks as he was to be found at the side of Martin Luther King Jr. He was as likely to be found talking about crops over the fence with his neighbor as he was to be found on any given weekend preaching in some of America's biggest churches. He was super frustrating to those around him. He didn't follow the rules. And he was especially frustrating if you needed him to pick a side. If you needed him to draw a line in the sand between this person or that person. Campbell died in 2013, and I am pretty convinced the world is less of a place without him. I'm also convinced that he would have known, or at least been willing to hazard a guess about who Jesus would have eaten with. I think Campbell would say that Jesus would have eaten with the sinners, with the cheaters and the liars and the gamblers, with all of us. I think Campbell would say that Jesus would have eaten with the person that you despise the most. The person who has hurt you the most. That doesn't mean you have to. I'm all about boundaries when it comes to our own well-being and sanity. But Jesus would have. Campbell would have eaten, and I think says that Jesus would have eaten with the Republicans and the Democrats, with the Louisville fans and the Kentucky fans, maybe even the Hoosiers. I don't know. But one of my favorite truths about Campbell is this. He was in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel the night Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. And that picture up there with him with Ralph Abernathy is after Martin Luther King's murder. He was there as King's friend and fellow activist. But what you need to know is that Will Campbell was also with a man named Bobby Jones, a former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. The night before Bobby went to prison for his acts of hate. Not only was Campbell with Bobby Jones, he went to celebrate communion with him, to be at table with him. And as he did, he prayed, Lord, Brother Bob is going off to jail for a while. And we're going to ask you to kind of keep an eye on him, Lord, because you know he's not a saint. And you also know that we sure ain't. But the book tells us that that's why you died. So that God and sinners could be reconciled. I read an interview with Will Campbell this week. And in it he said that for him, the truth of the gospel is summed up in a tiny sentence at the end of chapter 5 of 2 Corinthians. God was in Christ, reconciling the world unto himself, not imputing their trespasses against them. Or as I used to say to the middle schoolers that I used to work with, God only holds God's love over us, not the ways that we fall short of that love. Will Campbell lived the love of God as he knew it, welcomed those as Jesus would have welcomed them no matter what. And here's why I think this matters when we talk about Zacchaeus or at middle school lunchrooms or when we think about our own circles of friends and who it is that we choose to be with. And this is what I found new about Zacchaeus this week. Jesus did not lecture Zacchaeus. He didn't even preach to those who grumbled about it. He didn't issue some grand proclamation about a new rule to follow or what everyone was supposed to do. He just said, hey, Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house for lunch today. And suddenly, maybe for the first time in his life, Zacchaeus was seen and heard. Jesus chose on a regular basis to eat with some of the most unlovable and misunderstood and feared people around. And it made all the difference. Because as it turns out, how we actually live out our faith, as opposed to what we just say about it, is what really matters. And for me, the story of Zacchaeus makes it pretty clear that walking the walk is what God's after when it comes to how we extend the love of God and the grace of Christ to others. Let me be very clear, this is hard work. And y'all, the list of people that I do not want to sit at table with is long. It is hard work. But my prayer is that we will have the grace and the courage to do it. In this place and way out there in the world. Amen.